It only takes one moment to spark a movement. One teenager, standing alone in the face of ridicule, whispers of doubt and the heavy weight of history, chose not to bend. At first, it seemed like an ordinary school day. The same halls, the same lessons, the same quiet hostility that often went unspoken. But on that day, something shifted. He refused to stay silent, and in doing so, changed not just his own life, but the very culture of an entire school. This is the story of a young black teen who defied racism, and why his courage still echoes today. The story begins in a suburban high school that prided itself on diversity, yet beneath the surface, tension lingered. Posters on the walls spoke of equality and unity, but in classrooms and cafeterias, subtle prejudice quietly thrived. He was only 16, a bright and ambitious student, carrying the hopes of his family who had fought for every inch of opportunity he now had. His name was Marcus, a name his parents chose deliberately, drawn from leaders who had fought before him. To them, his education was not just his future, but a victory over centuries of struggle. Marcus was gifted academically and carried himself with quiet determination, but in the halls of his school, he often felt like a shadow. Teachers who overlooked his raised hand, classmates who mocked his hair, his accent, or the music he loved, coaches who assumed his worth began and ended on the basketball court. Each slight seemed small to outsiders, but together, they built an invisible wall around him. At first, he let it pass. His parents had always told him, "Keep your head high, don't give them an excuse." So he studied harder, worked longer, smiled when it hurt, and tried to believe that if he just did well enough, the whispers would fade. But it didn't stop. It only grew worse. A teacher accused him of plagiarizing because, in her words, students like him didn't usually write essays that good. A counselor steered him away from applying to top colleges, suggesting he focus on realistic options. And in the cafeteria, a racist joke slipped from a classmate's lips while others laughed nervously. No one dared confront it. For Marcus, the breaking point came quietly, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the sting of seeing his younger sister, who had just entered the same school, facing the same dismissive treatment. He realized then that silence was no longer an option. He knew the cost of speaking out. He knew the risk of being labeled a troublemaker, the target of whispers, the subject of administrative backlash. But he also knew something greater. If he didn't stand, nothing would ever change. Marcus began researching. Late at night, in his room, surrounded by history books and the glow of his laptop screen, he read about those who had come before him. Teenagers who had walked into segregated schools during desegregation, young voices who had fueled the civil rights movement, ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage. He realized he was part of a much larger story, and his school was only the newest battlefield in a centuries-old fight. He started small. He wrote about his experiences in essays, slipping them into the school newspaper. Some were published, though others were quietly rejected with vague excuses. He began organizing informal meetings with friends, speaking about the need for equality in classrooms and hallways. Some dismissed him, saying change was impossible, while others urged him to keep going. Word began to spread. Some students who had never spoken out before came to him privately, sharing their own stories of discrimination. For the first time, Marcus realized he wasn't alone. The weight he carried was shared, and together was lighter. But the administration was not pleased. Teachers pulled him aside, warning him to be careful with his words. A vice principal called him into the office, suggesting that his activism might distract him from academics. Subtle threats hung in the air, a reminder that authority often sought to preserve silence. Still, Marcus pressed forward. He proposed a black student union, only to have the application delayed, redirected, and eventually denied on technical grounds. He drafted petitions calling for anti-racism training for teachers, only to see them dismissed as divisive. Every step forward seemed to come with resistance, but every setback only fueled him more. The real turning point came when a racist slur was spray-painted across a school wall one morning. The entire building buzzed with whispers, students staring as custodians painted over it quickly. The administration released a short statement calling it an isolated incident, urging everyone to move on. But Marcus couldn't. To him, it wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger, festering problem. And if no one else would speak the truth, then he would. He began planning something bigger, not just quiet essays or small meetings, but a public stand. The assembly was supposed to be routine, a morning gathering about school spirit and upcoming events. But Marcus saw it as a moment. With trembling hands and a heart pounding in his chest, he stepped onto the stage when his turn came, his prepared remarks neatly typed in his pocket. But he didn't read them. Instead, he spoke from the truth burning inside him. He spoke about the slurs, the dismissals, the quiet racism that stained the hallways. He spoke about students like him being told they weren't good enough, about being underestimated not because of ability, but because of skin color. He spoke about teachers who looked away, classmates who laughed at racist jokes, administrators who chose silence over justice. Every word felt like stepping into fire, but Marcus kept going. He called for change, demanded equity, urged students and staff alike to confront what had long been ignored. At first, the room was silent. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few rolled their eyes. But then something happened. Applause. A small ripple at first, then louder, until the gym thundered with it. Students who had never spoken about racism before found their courage in his. Teachers who had looked away lowered their heads in shame. And the administration, caught off guard, realized the silence they had relied on was broken. The days that followed were tense. Marcus was called into meetings, questioned, even criticized for disrupting school order. But the truth was already out. His words had spread, shared in whispers, retold in classrooms, even picked up by local media. Change at first was slow, but it came. The denied Black Student Union was suddenly approved. Anti-racism training was no longer divisive, but necessary. Teachers who had once dismissed students began rethinking their assumptions. Students who had once felt invisible realized they had a voice. Marcus didn't single-handedly end racism in his school. No one person could. But he cracked the wall of silence. He showed that courage could come from the most unlikely places, and that one voice, refusing to be silenced, could echo louder than an entire system of denial. For Marcus, the journey was not without scars. He lost friends who didn't understand. He carried the burden of being the activist, the one who always had to speak out. But he also gained something far greater, the knowledge that he had sparked a shift, not only for himself but for generations to follow. And so the question lingers, what about us? How many injustices do we let pass in silence, convincing ourselves they are too small, too distant, too insignificant to confront? And how different would the world be if, like Marcus, we found the courage to speak, even when our voice trembles, even when we stand alone? Because sometimes all it takes is one teenager, one moment, one refusal to stay silent to change everything.